How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. This is PSReady, my channel all about PlayStation. If you want to keep up to date on everything in the world of PlayStation, your PS5, your Portal, your eventual PS5 Pro, make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications set to all. In today's video, I've got 3 news stories to cover. The first one is that Sony may have just saved the PSVR 2, and I hope they respond to this insane sales increase. Second on the list, one of my favorite publishers has had a 50% drop off in sales, but I'm going to tell you why and why it's not a big deal. And third, we just got our first look at Bluepoint's next game, which has me really excited. Anyway, let's jump into this first news story here, which is all about the PSVR 2 absolutely exploding in sales. So if you didn't catch the last video, we talked about how Sony is kind of at the point with the PSVR 2 where they're just giving up on making money on it, because in past generations, like with the PS3, the PS4, Sony would sell those consoles at a little bit of a loss with the intention of making that up later on game sales, right? Because if they sell a first-party game on the PlayStation Store to you, they get 100% of the profit. If they sell a third-party game on the PlayStation Store to you, they get 30% of the profit there. So they're making a ton of money on games. That means they can afford to sell their consoles at a little bit of a loss because they'll recoup the money later. This generation, things changed though. They did not want to go into this generation with the same philosophy they've used basically since the original PS1, where the PS1 came out at an extremely high price, but very quickly fell in price to the point where they were losing money on it, and then of course they made their money back on game sales. So with the PS5, they have said multiple times that they are not taking a loss on that thing at all. Whether you buy the digital model, the disc model, they are making money on the PlayStation 5. They've even increased the price throughout its 4 or so year life cycle since it came out in other countries around the world, which, you know, is kind of a bummer, right? Like, I think the old philosophy was obviously better, because right now especially is paying more for stuff really sucks, right? Like, everything is so ridiculously expensive. Like, I just stopped at the gas station after the gym to pick up a protein milk and a white Monster, and I ended up getting like a bag of chips too. It was like $17 for all of that, and that, it's absolutely insane, right? Like, the one time I go to Subway in a month because I'm just craving Subway for some reason, $15? Are you serious? But the worst part is that expanded out to all the accessories as well. So the PSVR 2, they're not taking a loss on that thing. They packed a ton of great hardware into it, like OLED screens, foveated rendering, more comfortable to wear, making sure it was a single cable device. They invented new controllers for it instead of using the Move controllers from the PS3. All of that adds up to a point where they were selling it for more than the cost of a PlayStation 5. Not even the digital model, the full-on disc model was actually cheaper than buying a PSVR 2, and that's insane. And this is a situation where I'm not going to blame the games, because while there aren't a ton of PSVR 2 games, the stuff they've put out this generation of VR versus the last generation has been much better. You've got Resident Evil 4, you've got Resident Evil Village, you've got Pavlov, you've got Into the Radius, you've got like all these great games that are already out, and then upcoming are a new Metro game, a new Alien game, Skydance's the Behemoth. So there is stuff to play on the PSVR 2, but people weren't buying it, and the like obvious answer is that insane price. And that was just proven because, as we talked about in the last video, Sony just dropped the price of the PlayStation VR 2 by $200. So if you bought the bundle with Horizon Call of the Mountain, that would be $350, and if you bought just the regular old PSVR 2, that would be $300, which is $200 less than the most expensive PlayStation 5, which is awesome. And I was really curious in the last video if that would be enough. I even titled the story, "Is it too little too late?" And it turns out it's not too little too late. It's exactly what they needed to do, because sales are up on the PSVR 2 by over 2,000%. And I know the caveat there is that you could say, oh, this thing wasn't selling well enough at all to make 2,000% a big enough increase. But if Sony is reading the tea leaves correctly, they basically found the price point people are willing to buy this hardware at. And honestly, they should just go back to how they did things in the past generation and just keep it at that price permanently and take a loss on the hardware, right? Like, we've seen this play out so many times with Sony. We just saw it with the PlayStation Portal, right? There have been so many remote play devices coming out over the past couple of years. There's a Logitech G Cloud, Razer had one. They all sold like absolute dog. But then Sony comes out with one that not only is good hardware like those other two, but also was at a perfect price point of $200, and people really showed up to buy that thing. They put it in a market where you can basically say, oh, it's $200 for something I might use a few times. It's a low enough price that makes it worth it in the long run for most people. And the same thing goes for the PSVR 2. At this price point, it's basically the best VR headset you can buy, because not only can you use it on the PlayStation 5, where it works incredibly with things like foveated pixelated rendering, which make the games look really good when you're looking at them, and the stuff you're not looking at kind of goes down in resolution, and then it updates the textures as you move your head around. But it also has these great controllers. It also has these great screens. It's also super comfortable. And then on top of that, you could just pay the price of a game to get an adapter for a PC that will let you use it as a PC VR headset. And at the price of $300, it's not only competitive with its biggest competitors like the Meta Quest 3, it's just better overall to pick one up, and people are responding positively to that by juicing the sales by over 2,000%. Half of me thinks Sony's just going to say, wow, we got rid of those things, like let's go on the current course that we've kind of started here, kind of killing off games that were in development for VR. We're not going to support this platform anymore. But like, man, they really do have an opportunity here to take advantage of people buying this hardware and actually get some more games in development, because once people have this thing, they're going to want to spend money on games to use it. Like, not having it in the first place, there was never really a big reason to spend $550 on this, but now that it's so cheap, it makes sense that people are excited about it and want to use the hardware. So support it. Give us games. This didn't happen with the PS Vita. When they put the PS Vita on fire sale, no one showed up either way. But seeing an explosion in sales like this, it makes me believe that the PSVR 2 finally could have a second chance of life and thrive for the first time ever. But yeah, knowing that you guys are the hardest of hardcore PS5 fans out there because you're watching a channel called PSReady, was this sale enough? Like, did you buy a PSVR 2, or is it just normies who are picking this thing up? I'm really curious what the audience is of people who took advantage of this insane price drop on the PlayStation VR 2 and actually went and picked one up. Please let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, that brings us to the second news story here, which is news about Capcom that at first kind of worried me, but then when I looked into it, I was like, oh, this isn't as bad as it seems. So Capcom put out their earnings report or whatever, they said this is how much money we made in the first quarter of 2024. And the big problem that they're facing is that sales are down by 50% from where they were last year. But there's a really easy explanation as to why. The first one is the biggest game they've released this year so far is Dragon's Dogma 2. That game's good, right? Like, it sold really well. It sold much better at launch than the first game did, but because of the performance issues and the sort of like obtuse way that game works, a lot of people fell off of it, and it kind of has a small dedicated audience just like the first game did. Like, it's bigger than Dragon's Dogma's ever been, but it's still not competing on the level of something like Elden Ring or even the Dark Souls franchise. It's doing well, it's just not doing as well as some of other franchises from Capcom like Resident Evil, Street Fighter, or of course, what is it? Monster Hunter. That's what I was looking for. Monster Hunter, Street Fighter, and Resident Evil, they all sell really well. And this year is a little weird compared to the last, since 2019 amount of years, where Capcom was on a very steady clip releasing a ton of Resident Evil games. They started with Resident Evil 7. They followed it up with Resident Evil 2 Remake. They followed that up with Resident Evil 3 Remake. Then they put out Resident Evil Village. Then they put out Resident Evil 4 Remake. And then it kind of stopped. Like, we have no Resident Evil games coming in 2024, and that is absolutely wild. So with that being one of their biggest franchises that's always driving sales in the background, you can kind of see why people not coming to the franchise because there's no game available would drop sales overall for Capcom, because those games sold through. They've been on sale a million times. You could get them for like as low as $10 at certain points, and they've kind of gone through their life cycle. And if you don't support the franchise with new games every year like they were doing, obviously there's going to be a big drop off there. They've also kind of branched out a lot more these past few years than they have the past few years before that. There's that new game, I think it's called I don't know, it has a Japanese name, like Kitsuyami or something. It's like a real-time strategy action game hybrid. I'm pretty sure it released on Game Pass, but it did not sell at all on Steam. It probably didn't sell at all on PlayStation 5, mainly because there's this weird effect that happens when a game gets added to Game Pass day one. It just eliminates all marketing for that game completely. Like, no one markets it. I saw a trailer for this game at Summer Game Fest, but I gotta be honest, the next time I heard about it at all was on my friend Jake Baldino's podcast, Friends Per Second. I was like, what the hell is this game? And then I looked it up and I was like, oh yeah, that's the new Capcom game. They also had Exoprimal, which was like their weird live service game where you would shoot millions of dinosaurs. That did not take off at all. I mentioned Dragon's Dogma 2 not being up to par with stuff like Resident Evil, Street Fighter, and Monster Hunter, but doesn't seem like Capcom's really worried because A, they have Resident Evil 9 theoretically coming out next year, which is awesome. I'm super excited for that. B, they have Monster Hunter Wilds coming out early next year, which is going to be a massive game for them because Monster Hunter Hunter World is their biggest game ever, and Monster Hunter Rise, despite not reaching the same peak as World, is still an incredibly performing game for them. I'm assuming that after we get Resident Evil 9, they'll probably have either a remake of 5 or this remake of 1 and 0 that we've been hearing all about for months now, ready to go pretty soon after that. They'll get back on their cadence of at the very least releasing a Resident Evil game every year. I think that Resident Evil 1 and 0 rumor is even more true now that we know that the next Resident Evil movie is actually going to be much more inspired by the first game and Resident Evil 0, whereas the last one, Welcome to Raccoon City, was like a mashup of 1, 2, and 3. And they've also announced that they're looking into how to take advantage of Mega Man better. So like, yeah, like on numbers, like paper, whatever, it's not great that their sales are down 50%, but it's just like an off year for them in terms of big releases and the stuff they have ready to go, like Dead Rising Deluxe Edition Remaster, which I'm super excited for, on top of everything else I mentioned. That basically sets them up perfectly to get us through the next few years with some awesome games. So yeah, I don't really think this is as big of a deal as a lot of websites are making it out to be. Anyway, that brings us to the third news story here, which is what Bluepoint is working on. If you're not aware of Bluepoint, they're basically this studio that Sony picked up to make remakes of games. So they started, I'm pretty sure, with Shadow of the Colossus on the PS4, which is a great remake of a great game. Then they also remade Demon's Souls for the PS5 launch, which, you know, I have no idea why that game didn't catch on. It came out basically the same year as Elden Ring. You'd think people would want to go back and play a remake of the first Souls game ever, but people didn't really seem to catch on to it. Like, it sold well because it was a launch title, but it didn't really make a huge splash. And then they put out that weird Christmas card that referenced a bunch of franchises like Castlevania and of course Bloodborne and a million others, and it had a bunch of weapons from those games. And then they basically went silent until we heard from their CEO recently that they were working on a new IP. And the interesting thing there is that through their own website, concept art of their new IP has leaked, and it looks like kind of more of the same from Sony, which is kind of confusing. Like, if you look at the screenshot, I have it on screen right now, it looks like it's pulled directly from some of the like sunnier environments of God of War 2018, but I did notice there's two characters and they both have weapons, so maybe they're kind of sticking with that Souls-like sort of nature that they've developed for the Demon's Souls, the remake that they put out with the PS5. I don't know, it's weird because Sony also in their earnings report earlier this year kind of mentioned that they are specifically a support studio. They're there to make remakes, they're there to help out other developers. So I'm assuming that while yes, they are working on a new IP for Sony, that's not the only thing they're working on. We've been hearing for so long now that there's a Bloodborne remake or remaster being either positioned for the PS5 Pro or the PS6. I don't know who could possibly make that other than Bluepoint, because they've A, already worked on a From Software game remaking Demon's Souls, and B, From Software is definitely not remaking Bloodborne after the hype of Elden Ring. I think their next game is either going to be a new Armored Core, some Armored Core DLC, or Elden Ring 2. I think there's no shot that they go back to Bloodborne at this point. And we've also heard there's a new Uncharted reboot in the works from a smaller studio. It could be Bluepoint. We've heard that there's a remake of the first God of War trilogy, like God of War 1, 2, and 3, the Greek saga, that's going to be more in line with what we saw from God of War 2018. Obviously, Bluepoint would be a great candidate for that. So, you know, it's a total crapshoot what they're working on outside of their new IP, but I just got to be real. As much as I like seeing new IP, I'm more excited for their remakes because their remakes are always so good. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, I'm sure we'll hear about it later this year at the showcase because, of course, they've been working on whatever this is since presumably before Demon's Souls came out. And, you know, if they are working on something new, I'd assume it'd be a little bit smaller because what Sony needs right now is games to come out. So I'm assuming with these smaller studios like Bluepoint, they said, hey, start working on some smaller stuff that we can release in between the stuff from Santa Monica and Naughty Dog. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you in today's video. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching and shape on.